What if everything your family worked for, your land, your history, your legacy, was stolen? And what if the people who took it weren't just greedy developers, but a powerful network of corrupt officials who had been erasing families like yours for generations? That's exactly what happened to Nathaniel Carter. His grandfather's farm had been in the family for over a century, a symbol of hard work and resilience. But when Nathaniel returned home, he found something horrifying. 100 luxury homes were being built on his land. The worst part? This wasn't an accident. For decades, black families in his town had mysteriously lost their land through forged deeds, illegal sales, and even violence. His grandfather had tried to fight back, but before he could expose the truth, he was gone. Now, it was up to Nathaniel. But as he started digging, he uncovered something even more sinister. A forgotten cemetery beneath the development, filled with the remains of enslaved ancestors. And the people behind the land grab? They would do anything to silence him. This is a story of systemic racism, greed, and a battle for justice that would shake an entire town to its core. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We love hearing from you. If you believe in truth, justice, and stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode of Real Power, Real Corruption, and Real Consequences. Now, are you ready for the truth they never wanted exposed? Nathaniel Carter had never planned to return to Willow Creek. Life in Chicago had been comfortable, successful even. But when his grandfather, Jeremiah Carter, passed away, he had no choice but to travel back to the old family farm. He had inherited 250 acres of land, a piece of property that had been in the Carter family for generations. Nathaniel hadn't set foot on the farm in over a decade, but as he pulled onto the gravel driveway, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The house was just as he remembered, old, sturdy, filled with memories. The next morning, an urgent call from Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor, shattered any sense of nostalgia. "They're tearing it down, Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling. "Those HOA people, they've got bulldozers on your land, and they're building houses." Nathaniel's heart pounded. He threw on his jacket and drove toward the eastern fields, where he found a nightmare unfolding. Dozens of construction workers were laying foundations, their machines carving into the land. A massive sign read, "Future home of Willow Pines 100 luxury estates." His land. A sharp-looking woman in a tailored suit watched the chaos with a calculating gaze. "Excuse me," Nathaniel said, his voice hard with anger. "What's going on here?" The woman turned, offering a plastic smile. "Natalie Reynolds," she introduced herself, "President of Willow Pines HOA." "This is my land," Nathaniel snapped. "Who gave you the right to build here?" Natalie's smile didn't falter. "That's impossible," she said smoothly. "We purchased this property last year. We have all the legal paperwork." Nathaniel clenched his fists. "That's a lie. My grandfather never sold this land." Natalie's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "Perhaps there's been some miscommunication," she said, handing him a business card. "Feel free to contact our legal team." Nathaniel knew then and there that something was very, very wrong. That night, Nathaniel sat at his grandfather's old desk, searching for answers. The room smelled of pipe smoke and old books, just as it had when he was a child. He rifled through stacks of papers, crop reports, tax documents, old letters, but found nothing about selling the land. Then he noticed something strange. A single floorboard under the desk was loose. He pried it open and found a metal box inside. His hands shook as he lifted the lid. Inside were Jeremiah Carter's will, the original deed to the land, and a thick leather-bound journal. On top of everything was an envelope labeled for Nathaniel. He unfolded the letter, recognizing his grandfather's handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means they're trying to take what's ours." Nathaniel's breath caught as he read further. Jeremiah had long suspected that developers would try to steal the land. They had been pressuring him for years, making shady offers, even threatening him. But the most shocking revelation was in the journal. His grandfather had been meticulously tracking something sinister, a pattern of land theft targeting black families. Nathaniel's stomach twisted as he flipped through page after page of names. Families who had once owned vast acres of land, only to mysteriously lose it. Some had been forced to sell for pennies. Others had vanished without a trace. The final entry chilled him to his core. They will come for our land next. They will lie, cheat, and steal. But I have left behind the proof. You must finish what I started, Nathaniel. Do not let them erase us. Nathaniel sat in stunned silence. His grandfather had known. He had seen it coming. And now it was up to him to fight back. As he closed the journal, he made a vow. He would not let them win. Nathaniel barely slept. His grandfather's words echoed in his head, igniting a fire deep in his chest. The next morning, he drove straight to the county records office, determined to find out how the HOA had gotten its hands on the deed to his land. The clerk, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Wilkins, barely glanced up from her paperwork when he approached. "Property records?" she asked, bored. "I need to see the sale records for my grandfather's land," Nathaniel said, sliding his ID across the counter. Margaret typed something into the system, her expression unchanging. "According to this," she said, adjusting her glasses, "the land was sold to Willow Pines Development, LLC 15 months ago." Nathaniel shook his head. "That's not possible. My grandfather never sold it." Margaret sighed. "Look, if the sale is in the system, it means it's legal. You'd have to take it up with a lawyer if you think there's a mistake." But then something strange happened. As she turned the screen toward him, Nathaniel's eyes locked onto the signature at the bottom of the document. It read, Jeremiah Carter. His breath caught in his throat. The signature was shaky, uneven, wrong. His grandfather had never signed this. Nathaniel pulled out the journal and flipped to an entry dated just 2 weeks before his grandfather's death. "They keep coming to the house with paperwork. I won't sign a damn thing. Told them I'd rather die first." Nathaniel's hands curled into fists. His grandfather had been sick, too weak to fight. Someone had forged his name, and now Nathaniel was going to prove it. But as he stepped out of the records office, he spotted something that made his stomach drop. A black SUV was parked across the street. Behind the tinted windows, he could just make out a figure watching him. He had stirred the nest, and they knew it. Nathaniel spent the rest of the day gathering evidence. He contacted a property lawyer, Mr. Douglas Whitaker, who agreed to meet with him first thing in the morning. Then he made copies of everything: the forged deed, his grandfather's journal, and old land surveys proving the boundaries had been altered. As the sun set over Willow Creek, Nathaniel sat on the porch of the farmhouse, staring at the vast fields. This land had fed his ancestors. It was more than dirt, it was their history, their legacy. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Go back to Chicago. This isn't your fight." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. He tightened his grip on the phone, his jaw clenching. Whoever they were, they had underestimated him. The night was still when he finally went to bed. But at 2:37 a.m., something jolted him awake. The smell of smoke. Nathaniel shot up, coughing as thick black smoke filled his lungs. He stumbled out of bed and ran to the front door, his eyes widening in horror. The farmhouse was on fire. Flames engulfed the wooden beams, licking at the roof. The porch was already collapsing. He barely managed to grab the journal and his bag before sprinting outside. The heat seared his skin, and the sound of wood cracking under the flames was deafening. Mrs. Henderson, still in her nightgown, ran toward him from next door. "Oh my God, Nathaniel." He turned, gasping for breath. "Did you see who did this?" She shook her head, tears in her eyes. I just woke up to the smoke." "But," she hesitated, "I did see something earlier. A man in a dark jacket, standing by your fence." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. Across the street, just outside the glow of the fire, he spotted something. A sleek, black SUV, just like the one from earlier. Its headlights flicked on, and it slowly drove away into the night. The fire department arrived too late to save the house. The place where his grandfather had raised a family, where Nathaniel had spent summers as a child, was reduced to ashes. As he stood in the cold night air, watching the last of his past burn, something in him hardened. They thought they could scare him away. They were wrong. He wasn't leaving. The smell of smoke still clung to Nathaniel's clothes as he stood outside the ruins of his grandfather's farmhouse. The fire had taken everything: the walls, the roof, even the old wooden rocking chair where Jeremiah Carter used to sit and watch the sunset. But it hadn't taken Nathaniel's resolve. The black SUV had disappeared into the night, but its message was clear: leave, or things will get worse. Nathaniel wasn't leaving. At dawn, he drove to the law office of Douglas Whitaker, the attorney he had contacted the day before. The office was in a small brick building in the heart of town, its exterior modest, but well kept. Whitaker was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and a reputation for taking on cases no one else would touch. He glanced up when Nathaniel walked in, his eyes narrowing. "I heard about the fire," he said grimly. "You think it was them?" Nathaniel tossed the forged deed onto the desk. "I know it was them." Whitaker studied the signature, his expression darkening. "This is bad," he muttered. "And if this is what I think it is, you're in more danger than you realize." "I need to prove that signature is fake," Nathaniel said. Whitaker nodded. "I have a handwriting expert who can analyze this. But that's not the only problem." He slid a file across the desk. "I started digging into the history of Willow Pines HOA. Turns out they've been involved in several cases of land fraud. The problem is they always make sure the victims disappear, either by forcing them to sell or by destroying their credibility." Nathaniel frowned. "Destroy their credibility how?" Whitaker sighed. "By making them criminals." The words sent a chill down Nathaniel's spine. "You need to be careful," Whitaker warned. "Because if they follow their usual pattern, the next move will be to make you look like the bad guy." Nathaniel thanked him and left, his mind racing. He had no idea how soon that warning would become reality. Nathaniel barely made it back to what was left of his grandfather's property before he heard the sound of police sirens. He turned just as two sheriff's deputies pulled up in a patrol car. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, stepped out and unhooked his holster. "Nathaniel Carter?" Nathaniel's stomach tightened. "Yeah." "You're under arrest." "What?" Nathaniel took a step back. "For what?" The deputy smirked. "Burglary and destruction of property." Nathaniel stared in disbelief. "That's ridiculous." The second deputy, younger and more hesitant, pulled out a folded document. "We got a signed complaint from the Willow Pines HOA," he said. "They claim you broke into their office last night and stole classified documents." Nathaniel's pulse pounded. This was exactly what Whitaker had warned him about. "That's a lie," he said. "I wasn't anywhere near their office. My house," he gestured to the smoldering ruins behind him. "My house was on fire." The older deputy shrugged. "That's for the court to decide. Turn around." Nathaniel clenched his jaw. He knew fighting back wouldn't help. Slowly, he placed his hands behind his head as the cold steel of handcuffs clamped around his wrists. As they shoved him into the back of the squad car, he spotted Natalie Reynolds standing in the distance, watching with a victorious smirk. She had orchestrated this. And she had won, for now. The jail cell was small, with gray cinder block walls and a rusted cot bolted to the floor. Nathaniel sat on the edge of it, seething. He had called Whitaker, who promised to get him out on bail by morning. But morning felt a lifetime away. Then, something unexpected happened. A sheriff's deputy came to the cell and opened the door. "You made bail," he grumbled. Nathaniel frowned. That was fast. The deputy didn't respond. He just led him outside, where an unlikely rescuer was waiting. Sarah Henderson, the elderly neighbor, stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed. Beside her was her 8-year-old grandson, Elijah, who looked up at Nathaniel with wide eyes. "I knew they'd come after you," Sarah said, handing him a brown envelope. "That's why I got ahead of them." Nathaniel opened it, and his breath caught. Inside was a yellowed, crumpled document. "A land survey. We found it this morning," Sarah said. "Elijah was playing near the old well behind my house and saw something sticking out of the ground. Turns out it was this." Nathaniel knelt beside the boy. "Elijah, where exactly did you find this?" The child pointed toward the trees. "It was in the dirt," The wind must have uncovered it. Nathaniel unfolded the paper and scanned it quickly. His heart pounded. This was an original survey of the Carter land, showing that his grandfather's property was even larger than he had thought. It had not been sold. In fact, it contained a handwritten note from 1956 that read, "This land belongs to the Carter family in perpetuity. Any future sale requires explicit approval from all descendants." Nathaniel stared at it, realization dawning. This document proved beyond doubt that the HOA's deed was forged. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "You can't trust the law in this town," she said. "You need to take this higher. You need the media. You need someone who can't be bought." Nathaniel folded the paper carefully. She was right. The police, the courts, the HOA, they were all against him. If he wanted to win this fight, he needed to take his case to the world. Nathaniel sat in the dim light of Sarah Henderson's kitchen, the old land survey spread out in front of him. His mind raced. This document was undeniable proof that Willow Pines HOA had stolen his land. But what good was evidence when the entire system was working against him? Sarah poured him a cup of coffee, her wrinkled hands steady despite the storm brewing around them. "I called my nephew in Atlanta," she said. "He's a journalist. A damn good one. He wants to hear your story." Nathaniel exhaled. This was his best shot. The local courts were corrupt, and the police were in on it. But the national media? That was a different battlefield. That night, Nathaniel drove 3 hours to meet Jamal Tate, an investigative journalist for the Atlanta Chronicle. Jamal was sharp-eyed, fast-talking, and carried himself like a man who had spent his life exposing the worst of society. He listened in silence as Nathaniel laid out everything: the forged documents, the fire, the wrongful arrest. When Nathaniel finished, Jamal leaned back and tapped his pen against his notepad. "You're telling me that an HOA stole your family's land, framed you for burglary, and burned down your house?" "Yes." "And you have proof?" Nathaniel slid the survey across the table. Jamal scanned it, his expression shifting from skepticism to something more dangerous. "This story is bigger than you think," Jamal said. "I've been tracking patterns of land theft like this all over the South. Every time, the same thing: wealthy developers push black families off their land, and the local government covers it up." He paused. "But there's something different here. You said your grandfather had a journal." Nathaniel nodded. Jamal leaned forward. "Did he ever mention the land before Willow Pines?" Nathaniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Jamal pulled out a folder. "I did some digging before I came here. Your family's land? It used to be twice as big. The Carter estate originally stretched over the entire eastern part of Willow Creek, including the land Willow Pines was built on decades ago." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. My grandfather never said anything about that." "Maybe he didn't know," Jamal said. "Or maybe someone made sure he never found out." The pieces started clicking into place. If this was true, then Willow Pines HOA wasn't just stealing his land now. They had stolen it before. And someone had been covering it up for generations. Determined to dig deeper, Nathaniel returned to the eastern fields the next morning. If the land had been stolen before, there had to be a record of it. Something his grandfather had missed. He wasn't alone. Jamal had brought a drone to scan the area from above. As they reviewed the footage, something strange caught their eye: a large, rectangular patch of land behind the development that looked different. The trees were thinner, the ground uneven. "What's that?" Nathaniel asked. Jamal frowned. "Let's find out." They hiked to the spot, pushing through thick brush. As soon as Nathaniel stepped onto the soil, he felt it. Something wasn't right. Jamal knelt down and brushed away some dirt. His fingers hit something hard. Wood. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. Together, they dug with their bare hands until the shape of an old wooden marker emerged. The name was barely legible, but Nathaniel could just make it out. Isaiah Carter, 1889 to 1932. Nathaniel's breath hitched. "That's my great-grandfather." They kept digging. More markers appeared. More names. Nathaniel realized with horror what they had found. A lost graveyard. "This isn't just your family," Jamal whispered, his face pale. "These are workers. former slaves, maybe. This could be a historical burial site. And the Willow Pines HOA had been building houses on top of it. Nathaniel felt sick. His family's land had been taken, erased. And now, his ancestors had been buried and forgotten beneath million-dollar homes. Jamal stood, wiping sweat from his brow. "This changes everything," he said. "If this is an unmarked cemetery, there are laws protecting it. The HOA can't build here." Nathaniel felt a sudden surge of hope. This was leverage. This was power. But before they could celebrate, the sound of tires crunching against gravel made them freeze. They turned just as two black SUVs pulled up, and Nathaniel knew they had been followed. Nathaniel's pulse pounded as the two black SUVs came to a stop just beyond the treeline. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grave markers they had just uncovered. The doors of the vehicles opened in unison, and four men stepped out, dressed in suits too crisp for a construction site. Yet their presence carried the weight of authority. Leading them was Natalie Reynolds, her sharp heels crunching against the dirt as she approached. But beside her was someone unexpected, a tall, older man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Nathaniel didn't recognize him, but Jamal's expression shifted. "Oh hell," he muttered under his breath. Nathaniel glanced at him. "Who is he?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "That's Judge Martin Reynolds." Nathaniel's stomach dropped. Natalie wasn't just the president of the HOA. Her father was one of the most powerful judges in the state. Judge Reynolds approached with an air of controlled authority, glancing down at the grave markers before looking back at Nathaniel. "You should have walked away, son." Nathaniel straightened. "I'm not your son." The judge smirked, unbothered by the hostility. "You think you've uncovered something big?" He shook his head. "Those bodies have been in the ground for over 100 years. You don't have a case." Jamal stepped forward. "Actually, under state law, disturbing an unregistered cemetery is a felony. If you built over this land without a historical review, The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "You misunderstand." His voice was smooth, confident. "There won't be an investigation, because there is no cemetery." Nathaniel's fists clenched. "You can't just make this disappear." The judge's smirk deepened. "I've been making things disappear for a long time, Mr. Carter." That was when the realization hit Nathaniel like a freight train. This wasn't just about Natalie. Her father had been orchestrating everything. The forged land sales, the stolen deeds, the families that had vanished. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. "This isn't the first time you've done this." Judge Reynolds chuckled, as if amused by Nathaniel's defiance. "It started long before you were born, before your grandfather was born. You think you're the first Carter to fight me." He took a step closer. "Your family has been in my way for generations." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "What did you do to them?" The judge shrugged. "Some sold willingly. Others required more persuasion." He gestured around. "And now you stand here just like your grandfather, just like his father, fighting a battle you can't win." Jamal gritted his teeth. "You don't get to decide what history remembers." Judge Reynolds glanced at Natalie. "Is this the journalist?" She nodded. "Jamal Tate, Atlanta Chronicle." The judge sighed. "What a shame." He motioned to the men in suits. Nathaniel tensed as two of them pulled out silencers. His breath caught. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to eliminate. "Run!" Jamal yelled. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the trees, Jamal right behind him, as the first shot cracked through the silence. Bark exploded from a tree near his head. His lungs burned as he sprinted deeper into the woods, branches whipping against his arms. Jamal cursed as he nearly tripped over a fallen log. "We need cover." Nathaniel spotted a rusted storm drain up ahead. There. They slid down the embankment, crashing into the metal grate. Nathaniel yanked it open and shoved Jamal inside before diving in himself. The tunnel was pitch black, damp, and smelled of rust and decay. They ran blindly through the darkness, the echo of their footsteps masking the sound behind them. It wasn't until they reached the far end, emerging near an abandoned shed, that they finally stopped to catch their breath. Jamal wiped the sweat from his brow. This just got real. Nathaniel leaned against the wall, his mind racing. They had the evidence, the cemetery, the land survey, the forged documents. But now they had something even bigger. Judge Reynolds had confessed. Not directly, not in writing, but he had admitted to years of corruption. And Nathaniel had caught it all. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was still recording. Jamal let out a breathless laugh. "Tell me you got it." Nathaniel grinned. "Every word." Jamal exhaled. "That's the best insurance policy we've got." But their victory was short-lived. Nathaniel's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. A distorted voice came through. "You think that recording will save you?" Nathaniel's grip tightened. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "You don't know who you're really up against." The line went dead. Nathaniel stared at the screen. A cold realization crept over him. Judge Reynolds was powerful. But this was bigger than him. Nathaniel's heart pounded as he stared at his phone's blank screen. Whoever had just called him, whoever had threatened him, knew. Jamal ran a hand over his face. "You think that was Reynolds?" Nathaniel shook his head. "No, this is bigger than him." They didn't have time to waste. They had the evidence, but evidence meant nothing if they couldn't get it out before it was buried, or before they were. Nathaniel pulled up his messages and sent the recording to multiple cloud storage sites. Then he forwarded it to Jamal's newsroom, a lawyer in Atlanta, and 2 civil rights organizations. "Done," he said. "Even if something happens to us, this goes public." Jamal exhaled. "Then let's make sure we live long enough to see it happen." They needed to get to a safe location, somewhere outside the reach of Judge Reynolds and his network. But as they emerged from the storm drain, something felt wrong. The streets were too quiet. The few street lights flickered, casting eerie shadows. It was nearly midnight, and Willow Creek was a town that usually slept early. That's when Nathaniel spotted the first black SUV. It was parked across the street, its engine running. Another one idled further down, near the intersection. "We're being watched," Jamal muttered. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. They needed a way out. He scanned the area. The town's bus station was a few blocks away. If they could make it there, they could catch a late-night bus to Atlanta, where Jamal's newsroom would provide protection. "Follow me," Nathaniel whispered. They kept the shadows, moving quickly. They had almost made it to the next block when a car door slammed. "Mr. Carter." Nathaniel froze. A man stood under the dim glow of a street lamp. He was older, his suit crisp but unfamiliar. Unlike the men who had chased them earlier, this one carried himself with an air of control, not muscle, but money. Nathaniel had no idea who he was. "I was hoping we'd have the chance to talk," the man said, stepping forward. "My name is Vincent Mercer." Jamal tensed beside him. "Mercer? As in Mercer Holdings?" Nathaniel glanced at him. "Who?" Jamal's face was grim. "They own half the real estate firms in Georgia." Nathaniel's stomach sank. "And why does someone like you care about my family's land?" Vincent Mercer smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Because I've been invested in this land for over 20 years, he said. "And I don't like disruptions." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. Reynolds had never been the real mastermind. It was this man. Nathaniel clenched his fists. "You stole my family's land. How long has this been going on?" Mercer's smirk didn't waver. "Longer than you've been alive." He gestured lazily. "You think this started with the Willow Pines, HOA? Judge Reynolds?" "No. They were just tools, useful ones, but tools nonetheless." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "So you're behind all of it?" Mercer tilted his head. "Not just here. Everywhere." Nathaniel felt sick. This wasn't just his fight. This was bigger than he had imagined. Jamal, who had remained tense but silent, suddenly stiffened. He reached into his jacket pocket and whispered, "Nathaniel." Nathaniel turned. Jamal pulled out his phone and showed him the screen. A new text message. "Do not trust him. There is a traitor." Nathaniel's heart stopped. His pulse pounded in his ears. If Mercer wasn't the traitor, then who was? Before he could react, the distant roar of an explosion shook the night. A fireball erupted in the distance, in the direction of Sarah Henderson's house. Nathaniel's blood turned to ice. "No," Mercer chuckled. "Your problem, Mr. Carter, is that you don't know when you've lost." Nathaniel ran. Jamal was right behind him, but he barely heard his friend's footsteps. His entire focus was on getting to Sarah's house, praying that she and Elijah had somehow made it out. But when they arrived, the house was gone. Fire raged, consuming everything. Sirens wailed in the distance, but Nathaniel knew it was too late. The woman who had saved him, the child who had found the survey, they were gone. Nathaniel's vision blurred with rage and grief. This wasn't just about land. This was war. The fire raged like an untamed beast, devouring the remnants of Sarah Henderson's home. Nathaniel stood frozen, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He had fought this battle thinking it was about land, about history. But now it was about lives. Jamal gripped his arm. "Nathaniel, we have to go. This wasn't just a warning, it's an execution." Nathaniel's breath came hard and fast. Sarah and Elijah had been his allies, innocent in all of this. And now, gone. "We're going to expose them," Jamal pressed, eyes burning. "But we can't do it standing here, waiting to be the next targets." Nathaniel swallowed back his grief and rage. Jamal was right. They ran. Through back roads, across empty fields, they kept moving until they reached the outskirts of town. Jamal led them to an abandoned barn, a place no one would think to look. As soon as they got inside, Nathaniel collapsed against the wooden beams, his mind racing. The recording of Judge Reynolds' confession was still safe in the cloud. The survey proving his land had been stolen was still intact. But now the war had escalated. "Sarah and Elijah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They didn't have to, they did," a new voice cut in. Nathaniel and Jamal spun around. A man stepped out of the shadows. Nathaniel's body tensed, but Jamal gasped. "No way." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. The man was in his 40s, wearing a simple jacket, but there was something about him, an air of command, of control. His stance was military, his gaze sharp. "Who the hell are you?" Nathaniel demanded. The man exhaled. "Special Agent Mark Colton, FBI." Nathaniel blinked. "FBI?" Colton nodded. "I've been working undercover in Willow Pines for 2 years." Jamal stepped forward. "You're saying the FBI has been investigating the HOA?" "Not just the HOA," Colton corrected. "The real estate fraud, the bribery, the missing families, everything." His eyes darkened. "I was getting close, but Mercer and Reynolds found out. They started eliminating witnesses. I barely got out alive." Nathaniel felt his pulse quicken. "Sarah and Elijah." Colton shook his head. "I got Sarah out." Nathaniel's breath hitched. "What?" "She and Elijah are safe," Colton confirmed. "I pulled them out before the explosion. But Mercer and his people think they're dead." A wave of relief crashed over Nathaniel, but it was quickly replaced by fury. "They murdered innocent people," he said, his voice shaking. "And they think they're untouchable." Colton nodded grimly. "They almost are. But you have something no one else does." The recording, Jamal realized. Colton pulled out his phone. "I can get you federal protection if you hand over the evidence. But we have to move now, before Mercer realizes Sarah's alive." Nathaniel stared at him. Then his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I know you're with the Fed. They won't save you." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "We've been compromised," Nathaniel said, shoving his phone at Colton. The FBI agent's face darkened. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could move, Colton's own phone rang. He answered, his expression instantly shifting. "You're sure?" he asked, voice tense. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Send it to me." He hung up and turned to Nathaniel and Jamal. "You're not going to believe this." Nathaniel clenched his fists. "Try me." Colton held up his phone. On the screen was a financial document, a wire transfer from Vincent Mercer's private account to Natalie Reynolds. Nathaniel frowned. "Wait, why would Mercer be paying her? She's his pawn." Colton's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not anymore." Nathaniel's stomach dropped. "She turned on him," Jamal murmured. Colton nodded. Natalie's been funneling money out of Mercer's accounts for months. Looks like she planned to cut and run. Nathaniel let out a bitter laugh. So the Queen's trying to take the King's throne. That's why Mercer's tightening his grip, Colton said. He's losing control, and when men like him feel that happening, they burn everything. Jamal finished grimly. Nathaniel clenched his jaw. We can use this. Colton nodded. If Mercer finds out Natalie is stealing from him, she won't last the night. We could use her fear against her. Nathaniel exhaled. We make her an offer. Colton raised an eyebrow. What kind of offer? Nathaniel smirked coldly. One she can't refuse. Nathaniel sat in the back of an old diner on the outskirts of town, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The neon sign outside flickered, buzzing faintly in the still night air. Across from him, Special Agent Mark Colton and Jamal Tate were deep in conversation, going over the plan for what felt like the 100th time. She won't come, Jamal muttered, tapping his fingers against the table. She knows she's cornered. She'll come, Nathaniel said with certainty. Colton nodded in agreement. She doesn't have a choice. They had made sure of that. Nathaniel had leaked just enough information to let Natalie Reynolds know that Mercer had discovered her secret, her embezzlement of his money, her plan to run. Now, she was desperate. The front door of the diner creaked open. Nathaniel glanced up and met Natalie's wide, terrified eyes. She wasn't wearing her usual sharp suit. Instead, she was in a simple gray hoodie, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked hunted. She slid into the booth across from him, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. You set me up. Nathaniel leaned back, folding his arms. You set yourself up. We just made sure Mercer saw it. Her jaw clenched. What do you want? Colton slid a file across the table. Testimony. We need you to flip on Mercer and Judge Reynolds. Full confession. Signed statement. Natalie let out a bitter laugh. And what in return you keep me out of prison? Mercer isn't just after your freedom, Nathaniel said. He's after your life. Natalie exhaled shakily. She knew they were right. Nathaniel pressed forward. You help us, and we get you federal protection. You run, and Mercer finds you. One way or another, you lose. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then whispered, I want a deal in writing. Colton nodded. Done. She swallowed, then reached into her purse. For a brief second, Nathaniel tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, she pulled out a flash drive. This is everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every illegal land deal, every bribe, every shell company Mercer and Reynolds used. Nathaniel stared at it, hardly daring to believe. We have him, Jamal muttered. But Natalie wasn't done. There's something else, she said, glancing around as if expecting Mercer to burst in at any moment. He has one last play. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. What do you mean? She exhaled shakily. He knows you're coming for him. He's not going down alone. Nathaniel leaned in. What's he planning? Natalie hesitated. Then she looked him dead in the eyes and said, he's going to blow up the courthouse. Silence fell over the table. Jamal's eyes widened. What? He has connections in the county building department, Natalie said, voice low. They planted explosives in the old courthouse's foundation years ago. If he's cornered, he'll trigger them remotely. Colton cursed under his breath. He's insane. Natalie nodded. And if you think he won't do it, you don't know Mercer. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. When? He's waiting for you to make your move, she said. The second he sees an arrest warrant with his name on it, he'll push the button. Nathaniel clenched his fists. They had won. They had the evidence, the confession, the means to take Mercer down forever. But now, if they moved forward, Mercer would take innocent lives with him. We have to move now, Colton said, already dialing a number on his phone. I need bomb squads at the Willow Creek Courthouse immediately. Jamal stood. We have to find Mercer before he knows we're onto him. Nathaniel turned to Natalie. Where is he? She hesitated. He has a safe house. Out by the lake. He goes there when he needs to disappear. Nathaniel nodded. Let's go. They moved fast. Colton called for backup while they sped toward the lake. The roads were dark, winding through dense forests, But Nathaniel could barely focus. His thoughts raced ahead. Would they get there in time? Or was Mercer already preparing to bring everything down? The safe house came into view, a secluded mansion hidden behind tall iron gates. Jamal let out a low whistle. Damn, he really thought he was untouchable. Colton killed the engine. We go in quiet. We don't spook him until we're close. They moved carefully, creeping along the tree line. Nathaniel could see a single light on inside. Mercer was there. Then, suddenly, a gunshot rang out. Nathaniel dropped to the ground just as the mansion's front door burst open. A figure stumbled out. Judge Reynolds. Blood soaked his expensive suit as he clutched his stomach. His face contorted in pain. He collapsed onto the front steps. Mercer appeared in the doorway, a pistol in one hand, a detonator in the other. Nathaniel's breath caught. Mercer smirked. I told you, he called out. I don't lose. Then he pressed the button. Nathaniel barely had time to react before Mercer pressed the detonator. The explosion rocked the night. In the distance, the courthouse erupted into flames. Even from miles away, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and a deep rumble echoed through the trees. Oh my God, Jamal whispered, eyes locked on the fiery glow on the horizon. Nathaniel's stomach turned to ice. They had been too late. Inside the mansion, Mercer was already running. Move! Colton shouted, sprinting toward the front steps. Nathaniel followed, leaping over Judge Reynolds' motionless body. The older man let out a ragged breath, blood pooling beneath him. He was still alive, barely. Mercer disappeared through a back door. Nathaniel and Colton gave chase, sprinting through the massive house. The place was a monument to corruption, filled with expensive art, custom furniture, and stacks of cash carelessly left out on tables. But they didn't have time to process it. They had to catch Mercer. He was fast for an older man, shoving furniture into their path as he ran. Nathaniel barely ducked in time as a glass vase shattered against the wall beside his head. Mercer reached the garage, slamming the door shut behind him. Nathaniel skidded to a stop and tried the handle. Locked. Colton kicked the door hard. It didn't budge. Then, the sound of an engine roared to life. Nathaniel's heart pounded. He's getting away. Jamal burst in from another hallway, panting. What's happening? Mercer's in the garage, Colton snapped. Jamal's eyes flicked to a keypad beside the door. He lunged for it, ripping off the cover to reveal a security override panel. I can short-circuit this, he muttered, fingers working fast. Nathaniel listened as tires screeched inside the garage. Mercer was about to disappear. Jamal cursed. Almost got it. The lock clicked. Nathaniel ripped the door open. The garage door was halfway up, Mercer's black SUV speeding toward freedom. Nathaniel didn't think. He grabbed a nearby crowbar and hurled it with everything he had. It slammed into the back window, cracking the glass. Mercer flinched, losing control. The SUV swerved straight into a support beam. The hood crumpled, the windshield spiderwebbed with fractures. For a second, there was silence. Then Mercer stumbled out, dazed but alive. Nathaniel stalked forward, his chest heaving. It's over. Mercer laughed, blood trickling from his temple. You think this ends with me? Nathaniel clenched his fists. You're going to prison. Mercer smirked. I already bought the judge. Colton stepped forward, gun raised. Judge Reynolds is bleeding out on your front steps. I don't think he'll be much help now. Mercer's smile finally faltered. You're done, Jamal said. The courthouse is burning, your allies are dead, and we have enough evidence to bury you. Mercer exhaled through his nose. Then his expression shifted. Something was wrong. Nathaniel saw the flash of metal a second too late. Mercer lunged, pulling a hidden gun from his belt. Colton fired first. The gunshot echoed through the garage. Mercer collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the pristine white floor. Colton exhaled sharply, lowering his gun. That's one problem solved. Nathaniel stared down at Mercer's lifeless body. For the first time, the man who had controlled everything was powerless. But something still didn't sit right. Nathaniel turned to Colton. You said we had enough evidence. Colton nodded. Then why did Mercer think he could still win? The weight of victory didn't feel right. Mercer was dead. The courthouse was burning. But something was missing. Jamal was already digging through Mercer's office, looking for anything that could still help. This guy was sitting on a freaking gold mine of corruption, he muttered, stuffing documents into a bag. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered. Colton frowned. That's not normal. Jamal turned, brow furrowed. What do you mean? Colton opened his mouth, then stopped. Nathaniel followed his gaze to a computer screen in the corner of the room. The monitor was still on, displaying a video feed of security cameras. One of them showed the courthouse parking lot. Nathaniel's breath caught. A black sedan was pulling away from the burning building. Inside, barely visible through the flames, was Natalie Reynolds. Colton's entire body went rigid. No, Jamal's voice was barely a whisper. She played us. Nathaniel felt the full weight of realization crash down on him. Natalie had been the one to give them Mercer. She had told them about the bombs. She had led them straight to the safe house. And now, with Mercer dead and Reynolds dying, she was the only one left standing. She was never scared of Mercer, Nathaniel whispered. She was taking his empire for herself. Jamal swore under his breath. We just handed her everything. Nathaniel's pulse pounded. Not if we stop her first. Colton's hands curled into fists. I'll call every federal contact I have. We're putting out a national alert. Jamal grabbed his bag. Then we hit the road. If she thinks she can walk away from this, she's dead wrong. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. It wasn't over yet. Natalie Reynolds had played every side against each other. She had let Mercer burn. She had let her own father bleed out. And now, she was running. Nathaniel stepped forward, staring at the security footage. No, he muttered. She's not running. The others turned to him. She's disappearing, he realized. She had a plan from the start. She's vanishing before we can stop her. Colton grabbed his keys. Then we find her first. Nathaniel exhaled. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and distant sirens as Nathaniel, Jamal, and Colton raced down the highway. Natalie Reynolds had played them all, orchestrating her escape, while they were busy taking down Mercer. Now, she was vanishing. Colton gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes locked on the road. She's not just running. She's got an exit plan. Nathaniel nodded. Mercer and Reynolds were just stepping stones. She wanted them out of the way so she could take everything for herself. Jamal was in the back seat, working on his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. I'm hacking into local traffic cameras. If she's heading to an airport, a private airstrip anywhere. Nathaniel's phone buzzed. A new, anonymous message. You're too late. Nathaniel's stomach clenched. She knows we're chasing her. Jamal's laptop beeped. Got her. He turned the screen toward them. She's heading south. There's only one reason she'd go that way. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. The docks. If Natalie made it there, she'd disappear forever. Colton slammed the gas pedal. Then we end this now. By the time they reached the docks, the night was thick with fog, the air carrying the salty tang of the ocean. The place was nearly deserted, except for a single yacht, its engines humming. And there, on the deck, stood Natalie Reynolds. She was dressed in all black, her hair pulled into a tight bun. No panic, no fear, just pure confidence. You're persistent, she called out as Nathaniel, Jamal, and Colton stepped forward. Nathaniel's fists clenched. You're not leaving. Natalie laughed. You think I didn't prepare for this? She gestured around. You have no jurisdiction here. This boat is registered in the Cayman Islands. In 5 minutes, I'll be international. Colton raised his gun. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Natalie smirked. That's cute. Then, without hesitation, she pulled out a remote. Nathaniel's breath caught. Another detonator. Jamal swore under his breath. You've got to be kidding me. Natalie tilted her head. You really think Mercer was the only one who liked explosives? Nathaniel took a slow step forward. Where? Natalie's smirk widened. Take a wild guess. Colton's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, reading the incoming message. His face went pale. "The farmhouse," he whispered. Nathaniel's blood turned to ice. "No," Colton turned to him. "The new development project. The community you were trying to save." She planted charges in the infrastructure. Natalie grinned. "One button and everything you fought for goes up in smoke." Nathaniel's heart pounded. If she detonated those explosives, the families in those homes would die. Jamal looked at him. "We can't let her go." Nathaniel swallowed hard. "But we can't risk those lives." A tense silence fell over the docks. Then Nathaniel took a breath and made his choice. Slowly, he raised his hands. "You win." Natalie arched an eyebrow. What was that? Nathaniel took another step forward. "You win," he repeated. "You're smart. You played the long game. And we're not going to risk innocent lives." Colton's eyes widened. "Nathaniel." But Nathaniel ignored him. He stepped onto the gangway, moving onto the yacht. Closer. Natalie's smirk widened. "I knew you had a survival instinct." Nathaniel nodded. Another step closer. "But here's the thing," he said, voice low. "I read my grandfather's journal." Natalie blinked. Nathaniel took another step forward. He predicted everything Mercer would do, every move, every lie. But there was one thing he didn't account for. Natalie's smirk faltered slightly. Nathaniel stepped even closer, right within reach. "He didn't predict you," Nathaniel murmured, "because you weren't a player yet." Then he moved. Faster than Natalie could react, Nathaniel lunged, grabbing her wrist. The detonator slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the deck. Natalie gasped, trying to pull away, but Nathaniel twisted, slamming her against the railing. "You're not disappearing," he growled. Colton and Jamal rushed forward as Natalie struggled, but she was trapped. Jamal snatched the detonator off the deck and flipped it open. His eyes widened. She wasn't bluffing. "The charges are active." Nathaniel tightened his grip on Natalie's arm. "Turn them off." Natalie laughed even now. "Why would I do that?" Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "You're live," he said. Natalie froze. Nathaniel turned the screen toward her. Thousands of people were watching. He had started streaming the moment he stepped on the yacht. Natalie's face paled. Every news outlet in the country is seeing this," Nathaniel said coldly. "If you press that button now, you won't just be a criminal. You'll be a terrorist." The word landed like a punch. Natalie's breathing turned ragged. "They'll protect me." Nathaniel shook his head. "Not anymore." A long silence. Then she broke. Her shoulders sagged. Her fingers trembled. And then, with a slow, shaking movement, she pulled a second remote from her pocket. She pressed a button. Jamal checked his laptop. His breath came out shaky. "The charges are disabled." Nathaniel exhaled. It was over. Colton stepped forward and snapped cuffs around Natalie's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." Natalie laughed, but this time it was hollow. Nathaniel stared at her. Was it worth it? Her smile faded. She didn't answer. By sunrise, the headlines exploded. "Real estate tycoon exposed in live broadcast, Mercer dead." Natalie Reynolds, Indiana custody stolen land returned after decades of fraud. Nathaniel stood at the edge of his grandfather's land, watching as construction crews removed the last of the corrupted infrastructure. Jamal walked up beside him, shaking his head. "You did it." Nathaniel inhaled deeply. "We did it." The battle for Willow Creek had cost him everything. But for the first time in a very long time, he knew it had all been worth it. What do you think about this story? Were you surprised by the twists and turns? Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story full of mystery, action, and justice. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.